Okay, so we are continuing Bava Metzia. We are in Mem Amud Aleph near the bottom, the Mishnah on the bottom. And last week we went through the Mishnah, which we had been alerted to actually in the previous daf, about someone who gave peiros to someone else to hold, and the shrinkage of the peiros comes into play as to what the amount that has to be returned. And the Mishnah and then the Gemara in turn went into some detail about how you calculate and what you calculate, what's considered and when is considered shrinkage. And it's a very interesting study. This Mishnah that we're going to start today has the same approach, but here we're talking not about solids, we were talking about wheat and barley and spelt and flax, etc. Here we're talking about liquids, wine, primarily wine and oil, and the liquids have a different measure by which we measure what shrinkage is. And so it's really a very interesting study, and a machlokes and maroim as well. So we'll try to get into this at this time. So the Mishnah says, this is the Mishnah about 10 lines maybe from the bottom. Yotzelo shtus liyayin. The Tana Kama says that when you give wine to someone else to hold, whether it's and this applies, as the Rashi will say, by mechira as well, when we sell wine, but any transaction involving wine, then the person who receives the wine to hold it can deduct a certain amount, for which we say is the absorption of the wine in the barrel. So machlokes in Tana Kama and Rabbi Yehuda. Tana Kama says shtus, which is a sixth. That means 1/6 of the wine that's in the barrel gets absorbed into the walls of the barrel. And Rabbi Yehuda says chomesh, that it's a fifth. So in other words, so we're going to understand, is this a factual machlokes? What's the machlokes? It's either a sixth or a fifth. I guess we can measure it. I guess we can figure out what the actual amount is. But you see, corresponding to the previous Mishnah, that we're talking about shrinkage. We're talking about the what are you responsible to return to the person who gave you the wine? And the answer is, according to Tana Kama, you take off a sixth, and according to Rabbi Yehuda, a fifth. So Rashi says l'yayin, if hifkid etzlo yayin, if you gave him wine, the irvu im yeno, hakankanim bolin shitus, the kankanim, the barrels, absorb a sixth, says the Tana Kama. We don't know chamish. Okay, so that's the rule, and the Gemara is going to get into this in a little bit more detail. Now,
that's to say that sounds like an awful lot of absorption. I wonder, was this really just absorption, or is this also to account for the typical small leaks which you have in anything but a steel cask? You're going to have little bits leaking out here and there.
Right. So to the best of our knowledge, from what Rashi will tell us and we'll learn from the Gemara, we're not talking about leakage. It could have happened. We're talking about the materials used to fortify the barrels. We'll see, even Rashi gives us a detail depending where you were, what they used to line the inside of the barrel to make sure that it was watertight or liquid tight. Mm-hmm. So to your question, there is no indication that there's a constant leak. It's more, what have you fortified the barrel with so that the barrel cannot leak or cannot lose any more than a sixth or a fifth. So we'll get to that.
And one other thing, which is I wonder whether this issue here of this relatively large amount potentially getting absorbed by the barrel in some way, whether this has been used in any way with the controversy over the sherry casks.
Well, I mean, the question that we're going to realize from this Gemara, and we're going to ask, is whether or not once it's absorbed, can any more be absorbed? So in other words, if you've reached your limit, is there some way that some of that comes out and some new stuff comes in, or is it completely sealed now because there is no place to go? I mean, that's and what's interesting is that there is no discussion here whatsoever about anything that's already in coming out. So to your question, let's say it was absorbed with a liquid that is of questionable kashrus. I mean, we don't know. It was a yayin, it was a wine, or whatever else. So it was used once upon a time for that. According to the way we understand, and we will learn through this, okay, it got absorbed. It's now totally absorbed. It's nothing else can get in, but nothing can come out. So now the question is nothing can come out, and you now have, let's say, a kosher liquid that you can use going in. Why should you have a chashash that liquid is somehow going to be mixed with the liquid that's already absorbed? If there is no, it's not a two-way street. It's strictly a one-way avenue, and the avenue has been now totally blocked up. So then why should we have an issue? Just the fact that once upon a time there was something that was questionable that went into the walls of the barrel, but it's not coming out. If it's not coming out, then should we really be worried? I mean, that's a halachic shaila. But the question now, as a factual matter, you're going to see from this Gemara, there is no indication whatsoever that this should be a problem, that there should be any kind of leakage or anything coming back in. So that's a question I think that we're going to have to take a look at. What do I do?
Can I add to?
Okay, all right. So let's take a look at what the Gemara says. All right, so that's about wine. Now, what about oil? So the Mishnah is
Jay has a question.
Yeah, go Jay.
Aren't they missing the most important factor is specifying the kind of wood that is being used? Different kinds of wood are going to have totally different. I mean, this Mishnah is getting into material engineering.
Right.
What do we know about the material? We certainly would have to identify the type of wood that it is before you get into the question of the history of the barrel. Was there anything else added and so on? So why isn't the fundamental listed right above that says, we're saying that this is only wood from a certain tree?
It's interesting that you mentioned, it's interesting, Jay, that you mentioned that, because the Gemara, the Mishnah in terms of the Gemara, does not discuss the type of wood, but does discuss the type of material used as a sealant. It's the sealant that this Gemara is concerned with, not the wood. So the answer, I don't know if how significant different woods would be, although L'chara, you're right. A different wood should have different composition and should have a different absorption rate at the very least, or whatever it happens to be. But you'll see in a minute that the real concern is, what are we sealing it with to prevent the liquid? So maybe that's really where the focus should be, is on the sealant, not on the wood. That any kind of wood might be the same. Again, I don't know. I'm not an expert in wine barrels, but maybe you're right. Maybe maybe over the course of time we've come to realize that the barrel itself is significant in terms of the texture, the smell, the absorption and everything else. But let's hold that for a minute.
And if I can answer my own question,
yeah,
I would assume that they knew which kinds of sealants seal all the different types of wood.
That's what the Gemara is going to address. Yeah, the sealant. Exactly right. The
Gemara
does address the sealant.
They knew the science of the material engineering here.
Yeah. No, you'll see that in a minute. Exactly right.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So says the Mishnah Vayter. Yotzelo shlosha lugin shemen lemeya lug. That in other words, what the Mishnah is telling us is that when to every 100 lug is the measurement, to every 100 lug of oil, there is a deduction of 3 lug. In other words, if I give it to you to hold, then you can deduct 3 lug from 100 to return to me. Why? Because lugu mechza shemarim, you have to count 1.5 lug of sediment, which automatically gets deducted from the actual oil, and lugumerzo, 1.5 lug of absorption that takes place into the whatever the receptacle is that the oil is in. So for oil, we have a different measurement. We don't go by percentages like a fifth or a sixth. We're saying that it is 1.5 lug per 100 for sediment and 1.5 lug per 100 for absorption, meaning that when you return the oil, you return 97 lug out of 100. So that's the measurement that the Mishnah is giving us, kind of the halacha of the law as to what you have to do with oil. Now, I'll take a look here quickly. Rashi says, and again, this goes now to the whole Mishnah. Af hamocher. Remember the first Mishnah that we learned further up on top says hamafkid peris es chavera. If someone gave peris to his friend to hold as a pikadon, meaning not to sell. This Mishnah is dealing with outright sale. I'm selling you wine. Comes the Rashi and explains to us that there is not a significant difference between the halachas of mechira and the halachas of pikadon. It's the same. You use the same yardstick to measure. So what does Rashi tell us? Af hamocher kishem she'amru b'mafkid kein amru b'mocher shehamocher shemen l'chavero. Someone who sells shemen to his friend, v'nosalom mitov chaviyosov, and he gives him from his barrels kashuhu mistapek tamid, where he's constantly, going in and out and taking out oil, right? V'hu mezukik, and the oil is mezukah, meaning the oil is now clean, so that the sediment has already drifted to the bottom of the barrel. So this is a very important point, which we're going to discuss a little bit more later. In other words, if when you pour oil into a vat or whatever it is, you're pouring oil and sediment. Only after a while does the sediment separate itself from the oil, and the oil becomes pure. So what happened here is that the Reuven and Shimon made a deal. Reuven said, you know what? I need oil during the course of the year. I'm going to, over the course of the year, come to you every month, and I'm going to ask you for an amount of oil. And at the end, whatever oil is left, you'll return to me because I'm giving you a significant amount. So in essence, this is the case of Pikadon, the Shimon, the guy who's holding the oil, is constantly dipping into the barrel, into the vat, whatever it is, taking out oil and giving it to Reuven as he requests. Now, when you start off with 100 lug, it's got all kinds of stuff in it. Okay, after a period of time, which whatever it is, we don't know exactly, but there is a certain period of time by which the sediment separates itself from the oil. So what sediment, by the way, is heavy and it goes to the bottom of the barrel. So now you have pure oil on the top. So Reuven comes first month, the second month, the third month. Okay, at some point there's no more sediment in the mixture except at the bottom. When he takes his ladle, Shimon, and he ladles out the oil to give to Reuven, he's taking pure oil from the top. He's not mishing. He goes in, takes the oil, takes it with the ladle, and pours it into the guy's carafe or whatever he's carrying. So what is he giving him? Pure oil, no more sediment. Says Rashi, and the Mishnah will articulate that. So l'chara, you can ask, wait a minute. So there is no sediment involved here. Why do you take off for sediment? So inherent, our understanding of this Maisa is that he is taking off 1.5 lug of sediment, so that when he returns the balance to him, he will remove that amount, even though that sediment has settled to the bottom and all he's giving him pure oil. So we have to understand that that Shimon, who is the proprietor here and who is the one who is coordinating all of this, I mean, and it's going to be interesting to understand why what I'm saying is correct. There's a discussion here, but so accept the fact that the oil that he's giving him, which is pure, he's getting nothing but pure oil. You nevertheless separate 1.5 lug for the sediment that sort of flowed to the bottom and is now staying in the bottom. So that's what he says over here. Okay, so, and you also count 1.5 lug for the barrel, for the absorption. Now, what I just said, okay, if the oil was pure, which is what I just said, the Shemen was mezukah, and he only gave him from the pure oil, and the yotzelo shomrim, then there is no sediment. So the Tana Kama takes the position that if there's only pure oil, you don't deduct sediment. And if they were old barrels, you don't deduct absorption. To your point, Menashe, in other words, if we're dealing with old barrels that have already seen a lot of use and have had a lot of absorption, then there is no new absorption that we can somehow include into this equation. And when you have to give them back, you do not subtract 1.5 lug for absorption because there's nothing to absorb. So to the question of the sherry and of all these other things, I mean, again, this is not a halachic statement. This is, as a practical matter, the Mishnah is telling us this is how oil and wine were transacted. They were transacted either in new barrels for which there is absorption or old barrels for which there was no absorption. And the Gemara will elaborate a little bit on all that. But so the halachic question then becomes, if there is no there's no absorption and there's whatever is in the walls of the barrel, how do you calculate that with respect to the new stuff that's in there in terms of kashrus or in terms of absorption or all these other questions? All right, so we have a definitive statement from the Tana Kama that pure oil, if you're dealing in pure oil, you make no deductions. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, comes Rabbi Yehuda, and he says, Afa mocher shemen mezukah, even someone who sells absolutely pure oil without any sediment, lechavero, kol yamos hashana. In other words, throughout the year, like I explained, he comes every month and he gets his allocation of oil. He accepts upon himself, it's understood between the buyer and the seller that there is a deduction of 1.5 lug for shemen, nothing for absorption, because we're talking about old barrels, but nevertheless for sediment, there is a deduction. We don't say that it's totally pure. So we have a machlokes between the Tana Kama, there are two machlokes, one between Tana Kama and Yehuda with regard to wine, whether it's a 6th or a 5th, and a second machlokes between the Tana Kama and Rabbi Yehuda, whether or not, if you're dealing in absolutely pure oil, meaning that the oil was poured into a barrel and then over the course of the year it was ladled out and all that was ladled out was pure oil, whether or not you deduct that 1.5 of sediment. According to the Tana Kama, no. According to Rabbi Yehuda, yes. One thing that is clear, though, as a distinction from the previous Mishnah, last week when we talked about deductions, we talked about two deductions. We talked about a substantive deduction and then an annual deduction. You do, in other words, you subtract, but every year you subtract. In other words, the achbarim, if it's a case of the mice eating the food, every year they're going to eat their allotment. Here, there is no annual deduction. The annual deduction goes away because, for instance, once a barrel is absorbed, it's absorbed. You can't say, oh, next year it's going to be reabsorbed to the tune of another X number of lugin. We don't say that. So the annual absorption is removed, and according to and the only absorption that we're dealing with is the absorption that happened the first time. Okay, so that's this Mishnah. A little different than the other, but now we have the facts. Zok the Gemara, below Pligi. There is, even though the Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda have different versions of how much the absorption takes place, there's no argument. Why? Mar kiasrei or mar kiasrei. So the simple answer is, it depends on what jurisdiction you came from. In the jurisdiction that the Tanakama lived, they took a sixth, and in this jurisdiction that Yehuda lived, they took a fifth. Why? Ba'asri demar chafa bikira lo meyayitz tfei. In the jurisdiction of the Tanakama, you know what they used to seal the barrel? They used wax. They had a certain kind of wax that they smeared the inside of the barrel, and that only absorbed a sixth. Okay, so if that's what people did in that jurisdiction, you can't argue. They used a certain wax that they found time and again only absorbed 1/6 of the liquid, so that's all you can take. Says Rashi, they would smear the chavius b'fnim b'shava kederach she'osin onu b'zefes, with wax, the way we use zefes. Zefes is pitch. In other words, the stuff that when he says we, the common practice was to take some kind of a tar. Zefes is tar, and to tar the inside of the barrels, and that would create a layer, an impenetrable layer, a layer. So kufra is zefes. So now the machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and the Tanakama depends on whether you used wax or tar to line the barrel. If you used wax in that jurisdiction, it was only a sixth. If you use zefes being the pitch, then it would be a fifth. So he says, so that's why it's no machlokes. It depends on where you came from as to what you used. So that's one explanation to explain Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda. Iboyis Ema. Another explanation, Mishim Gargishta. But Gargishta is karka she'osim mimena hachavius. So to your point, Jay, when you said, why don't we see what kind of wood, what kind of material they're using? So Rashi says that we're not talking about wooden barrels. Wooden barrels may have come into the fore later. We're talking about clay barrels made out of earth. They would take earth, they would probably put it on some kind of a whatever they use to some kind of axle or whatever it was, and then they would form it, and that would be the barrel. The barrel is made out of karka. It's made out of earth, clay. So the answer is there's no machlokes between Tanakama and Yehuda, because it didn't depend on the reinforcement, whether it was pitch or wax, but it depended on the clay, how absorbent the clay was. Some clay is more porous and some is less porous. So depending on the clay, Gargishta, that's how the Gemara wants to answer Mishum Gargishta. Okay? Some clay is more porous and some is less porous. So as Rashi says,
just for a historical biblical note, Yocheved used both.
Say it again, David.
Yes, for a historical biblical note, Yocheved, and when putting Moshe in she used both. She used pitch and clay. Actually, I mean, she was dealing with wood, so she used pitch and clay.
And clay. So
Tamar and Zefes, like here.
Zefes, right.
Tamar. So she used both kinds of sealants.
Right.
And she was dealing with wood.
And she was dealing with wood. Okay. And the Gemara here says we're not dealing with wood, we're dealing with the karka. Okay, so there you have it. So in other words, those have a big influence on how much absorption there is. So he wants to say that there's no machlokes between these Amoraim, or Tanoim actually, because depending on where they came from, that's the method they use to store wine or oil, and Zehu. The Asad Rabbi Yehuda, Rami Arboim. Okay, so that's the end of that particular discussion until we come back to it a little bit. Now, the Gemara tells us something very interesting. And by the way, from this we're going to learn an etiquette in business. It's a very interesting Gemara. So the Gemara says as follows: Rami are Ba'asad Rabbi Yehuda, where Rabbi Yehuda lived. Rami Arboim B'timna Kuza Bedana. They used to sell. Kuza is a small measurement of liquid. I'm not exactly sure how it relates to a lug, but it's a small measurement. So, and Rabbi Yehuda, it turns out, was a storekeeper. He was a big lamdan, but he also worked. So he was a storekeeper. Okay. So what they did is, Rami Arboim V'tam Kuza Bedana. They took 48 kuz. They measured out 48 kuz of wine into a barrel. Ozoldana Beshita Zuze, and they sold this barrel of 48 for 6 zuz. So now Rabbi Yehuda was a retailer. So he went to the wholesaler and Paris Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda went to the wholesaler, so to speak, and he said, I'm going to buy these 48 kuz barrels of wine so that I can sell them retail. Well, that's what a person does, okay? So what did he do? So how did he make his living? First, Rabbi Yehuda shita bezuzeh. So Rabbi Yehuda would pour off 6 kuz into a smaller vessel, and he would sell it for a zuz. Okay, so now let's use our complicated math skills and figure out that if he took 6 kuz out of 48 and sold it for a zuz, then he'd have to sell 6 barrels of 6 barrels of 6 kuz each to recoup the 6 zuz that he spent for the barrel of 48. Right? Pretty simple. Okay. So let's see what the Gemara is telling us. Parish Rabbi Yehuda Shisha Shita Bezuzah. Then go to Mem Amid Beis. Dal Talson B'Shita B'Shita. So then he went ahead and he would sell 36 of these 6-barrel kuzes for and there he would make up his money. Okay, Poshale Tracer Dal, Poshale Tracer. So now what's he left with? If he started with 48 and he sold 36 of them, now he's left with Tracer, 12, right? So he has 12 left over. Dal Tamne Shesuse. Now, so from the 12 years left, he has to subtract Shesuse 6. Why 6? Because 6 would be absorbed into that barrel of 48. So he starts with 48 kuz. 6, in other words, yeah. And then 6 of 1/6, which is 8, 1/6, shususe, gets absorbed. So you have to subtract 8. He sells 6 times 6, right? So then now what's he left with? Poshale Arba. Then he's left with 4 kuz, and that's what he keeps. Okay, so that's the math. Frek the Gemara. All right, so we get the math, right? You start
Right.
with 48, you subtract 36, you subtract
Not much of a profit margin.
Yeah, what's the profit margin? 4. 4 kuz.
Yeah, well,
Wait a minute.
112. Well, at the end it's 112. Yeah, that's
Right.
not much
So-
of a.
So here's the kicker. Shmuel said, if a person is in business, he should not profit more than 1/6 of what he's doing. So we have a lesson in business. Shmuel says your profit should be 1/6 of your business.
And
But
his
that's not
profit
what
margin,
you're doing.
and his profit margin is half of that.
It's half
Right.
of that.
Right.
So it's a guy. It's a kasha. What is Rabbi Yehuda doing here? Rabbi Yehuda is entitled to a 6, and all he's getting is 4 kuz, and 4 kuz is a 12.
So maybe he's a Talmud Chacham, but not a very good businessman.
but again, this is a very important exercise because Shmuel is telling us what is proper and what even a Talmud Chacham should. You can't be a what's the word? You can't be asleep at the wheel. You've got to have parnasa, and you should do the right thing. So you should follow the rules. The rules say a 6. Go get a 6. Don't be a you know. So that's the Gemara's kasha. If after we do the exercise, it turns out that he's not even getting what he's supposed to get. Okay, so that's the facts. So and for the Gemara, ikegulfe v'shamre. No, that you miscalculated because there are 2 other factors that come into play here. And what are they? One of them is the tircha of the work. In other words, he has gulfe. Sorry, ikegulfe v'shamre. You know what? When you include what you're making, you also have to include the actual barrel. The barrel has some value, and the sediment, the shomrim. So, in other words, what the Gemara is saying is that even though he made 4, but that's the correct number because from the 8, which he should have made, you have to subtract at least something for the barrel and something from the shomrim. So look how exact this Gemara is trying to get down to the nickel or to the pruta of what it is that should be taken here. Frek the Gemara ihacha nafesh tfei mishtus. If that's the case, if you're going to say that the gulfa, the shomre, that the keg itself and the shomrim, the sediment are included in the profit, then how can you, Shmuel, say that the end of the profit should have been 1/6? It's going to be more than a 1/6, because if you have to add in the barrel and the profit, for which you later subtract, then he will have made more than a 1/6. You're right. Net, he will walk away with less, but his total profit, his gross profit, l'chaira, would have been more. Because you have to factor in the keg, you have to factor in the barrel, and you have to factor in the shomrim, the sediment. So, in other words, how are you looking at this? Are you looking at gross profit, net profit? What's the halacha? Okay, Shmuel, tell us, what should he have made here? Because in all likelihood, if he had sold it for more than a zuz, he probably would have gotten away with it, right? If Rabbi Yehuda had sold 6 kuz for 1.5 zuz instead of 1 zuz, or even 2 zuz, then presumably we're going to say, we don't know, that he might have been able to collect more money. So he would have had more money to start off with. So when you start stripping away the money that he has to pay, he'll be left with more money. Okay. So, and you want to be exact here, because the Talmud Chacham doesn't want to take more money than he's entitled to, but he shouldn't take less. So how do you evaluate?
I am getting extremely confused here.
Okay. Go ahead.
And I'm sort of looking a little bit going to Sparrier so I can follow along in the English as well, and I'm not sure whether they always have it right. So are we talking, I'm looking, first thing is, are we talking in this particular instance with this 48 unit barrel, are we talking about wine or are we talking about oil?
We're talking about kuz. We're talking about kuz of wine.
Because, okay, so the Sfaria translation, which again is not always correct, says oil, and we have them, and when we talk about sediment, and then coming up about Shem and Mezukak, that would all imply oil, because in the Mishnah we were talking about sediment, that was with respect to oil, not with respect to wine, though we know even today we have sediment from wine, but that wasn't in the Mishnah.
Right.
The flip side is, though, that if it's oil, then it shouldn't be a 6th. We're talking, it should be the 3 lug and 100, which is 3%.
Right.
So, which is far less than a 6. So I'm confused.
A little confusing. So kuz is a measure of wine. It is a measure of wine. So you're right when you're confused, because of we're interchanging sediment, but there is sediment in wine too.
There is. I know that
sediment in wine. So the Gemara is sort of inherently saying that yes, we're talking about wine, but we also have to include some sediment. By the way, we didn't talk about sediment up till now, but now we got to talk about sediment as well. So that is a little bit confusing. Right, I agree. Okay, so let's say that we started off with 48 kuz of wine, and he broke it up into sixes. So he sold six little barrels of 6 each. And that was the 6 kuz he spent. So now he's even Steven, and he's actually got some extra kuz sitting there. And so that's his profit. Now starts the Shakla Vitaria about what he's allowed to keep, what he's not allowed to keep. So as a practical matter, let's back up and say that, again, the Gemara now is telling us the difference between gross profit and net profit, which is something we should learn about. That you can have a gross profit and then you can have a net profit. The halacha says that your profit, it doesn't say gross or net, the profit should be 1/6. It doesn't tell us whether that should include what you're losing along the way or not. That's an issue. It's a problem. So having said that his profit was 12, and the Gemara then says, but wait a minute, he's only entitled to 6. Then the Gemara says, yeah, but you didn't factor in the 1/6 that gets absorbed into the barrel. And when you factor that 1/6 in, that he's really under the profit margin. He's under the profit margin. So now the Gemara has to sort of back up and has to say, no, that when we talk about profit, we're really talking about gross profit. And gross profit includes that which was already absorbed or lost through the sediment. And gross profit, he clearly cleared 1/6, right? He cleared 1/6. So then the Gemara says, yes, but if he cleared 1/6, then that's not really right, because he should have come in with exactly 1/6. I mean, this is very hard to really sort of grasp. So then the Gemara says, okay, so we have to just finish that line. So the Gemara says, so the Gemara ikatircha v'demei bruznaisa. Know that he didn't really exceed his profit margin, because there's also a small amount that has to be attributed, even though he made gross, he made more than 1/6. But when you start stripping away, you have to factor in. So Rashi says his tircha, meaning he has to go to the counter, he has to deal with the customer. So that exchange has a value. Everything has a value. So he's counting tircha as a value. All right. And verse Naisa, Shenosim Davim Lechendni Lemocha Motzir Machmas Alav Bechutzos. Karzanaisa Lashon Karza Lashon Acha here. Yesh Kivas Barza Bechavius Shelcheres V'Tzorach Litnschar. He has to hire someone to drill a hole in the barrel to put a spigot in order to turn on and off the amount of kuz that are coming out. He has to pay him a couple of cents. So what the Gemara is telling us is, by the time you get finished with all the miscellaneous expenses and everything else, it comes out to about 1/6. Now, it does it or doesn't it, you can make your own cheshbon. But
Rabbi,
go ahead.
yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt if I could. It says, where the Gemara says, "Ika gulfe ushmar maraya," right? Where we were saying, wait a minute, he's entitled to a 6, but he's only ending up with a 12. So the Gemara says, no, you have to take into account the absorption of the barrel and the sediment as part of his profit.
So it's
but how is that
profit?
Right? But how is that? In other words, the absorption of the barrel and the sediment, these are non-usable items.
Right.
In other words, profit has to be something, but their ultimate answer is, well, he's got expenses. You got to find somebody to tap it. You got to do other stuff. But they're ignoring the fact that this is not usable to him. So how do you include in gross profit that which he cannot sell, use, or do anything with? That's
a very interesting question, because how did they touch up profit? Simply not the way we define profit. So
right.
So with regard to the absorption, one of the things that comes to mind, remember what I said, is that when you have absorption in the barrel, that barrel now can no longer absorb. So in theory, he has gained the benefit of having of having a barrel that now going forward in the future,
For
everything
future
that goes
purchases.
in there becomes
Interesting.
not a deduction. That's the only way I can understand how absorption becomes an asset as opposed to a liability. As to sediment, I'm not exactly sure.
Yeah, right. The sediment is still stuck. I get the absorption because now he has a more useful,
More useful
Uh,
barrel. that
right,
can-
more
that- that-
efficient, a more efficient
more
barrel.
efficient, right.
Yeah,
But
interesting.
the sediment, I'm not sure where the sediment comes in, how that becomes, but nevertheless, in the minds of the Chachamim, when they were tallying this, whether they had business heads or not, they were saying that you got to take this into account, and this is part of the profit margin. What's the real profit? Well, I'm not quite sure what the real profit is, but it is part of the profit margin. So we
Thank
go
you.
back and forth, but it's a little tricky. But what I'm trying to show here, look how meticulous the Chazal were as to what it is that a person should be, and like Rabbi Yehuda. I mean, so what if he made a couple of shekel more? Who would get hurt if Rabbi Yehuda had a couple of more dollars to spend for his family? But yet there was such an exactness of what's profit and what you should be taking and not taking from the public. I find that really, really quite an exercise that the Chazal, that the Gemara is giving us, is to understand. Unlike our profit margins are 500%,
Right, right.
1,000%. We don't worry about a sixth or something. But the point of it is that this Shakla Vitaria goes into the finest points, as you point out, Yale. So what's the profit margin in sediment? I mean, we don't know, but yet it's counted as part of the profit margin. So anyway, so that's the way the Gemara looks at it. I think it's a very interesting discussion, and so the Gemara okay, right. So now we understand this machlokes. The Mishnah went on to tell us there was a second machlokes in the Mishnah. What's the second? The question is, if you have pure oil and you serve the pure oil to the customer, can you deduct the shomrim? Remember, he got 100. Now we're talking about shemen. So let's go to shemen. He got 100 lugi shemen, and the sediment over time, whatever that time is, there is a time factor, falls to the bottom. So the entire top of the barrel is pure oil. So all he's giving this fellow every time he asks for an allotment is pure oil. Can you deduct the shemen, the shomrim, when you return everything? Can you? This is what the next section of the Gemara is really going to get into. So first of all, we have a machlokes between Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda. Tanakama says that you cannot. Rabbi Yehuda says that you can deduct. Says okay. So let's now go start this discussion. What's the discussion? Says the Gemara. So here the Gemara is taking on a very interesting theory, and that and it says that no matter how old the barrel is, how many times it's been used, how many times it has absorbed oil, it still has room for more absorption. Okay, this is a new theory in the theory of absorption of oil. So the Tanakhama says that there's always room for more. Okay, if that's the case, no, that's not the case, because you used zefes. So now this goes back to the machlokes before that we had. Can you make it so airtight that nothing can get through? So we thought the answer is yes. The Gemara here wants to suggest that there's going to be some absorption. Says Rav Nachman, absolutely not, because it is so airtight from the pitch that nothing will come in. You don't have to say there was mizafin. Give him the tone. So he's more practical, and he says it doesn't matter whether you use pitch or anything else. Once you've completely absorbed everything you can absorb, you can't anymore. In other words, you know, the person who eats himself full to the brim, and you see here, take another bite. He says, I cannot take another bite. I have no place to put it. So that's what this shot is there's no place to put it, is completely absorbed. What's the point here? So the point is whether or not as a practical matter, can you deduct that 1.5 of shomrim if in fact the shomrim never gets absorbed, or if the barrel never absorbs anything? Now, how are you allowed to deduct something that is not deductible? That's the machlekes. So, and we're going to see in the discussion, which gets very interesting and detailed, that sometimes we have to make certain assumptions, and some of the Mandarim don't hold of the assumption. So that becomes the question: is what can you do with this pure oil? Okay,
Rabbi,
okay.
no matter how careful you are when you're doing it, if you think with yourself, when you're taking out, if you're making a recipe or something and you take out, it says 1/4 cup of oil, how many times when you pour it or when you transfer it from one to another, you're going to have spillage. So every time you're doing something like refining it,
Right,
you're working with a barrel,
right.
you're going to have loss. So they're trying to take numbers to be so exact. But yet on the other hand, no matter how careful you are, if you just tilt it the wrong way, you can have a leak and you're going to lose a percentage of it.
Right.
And
No,
then
you're right. The Gemara does not somehow account for that, because they figure that this is standing on its 4 legs, and you just take a ladle and dip in and ladle out without any spillage. But you're right.
And then you have all that left over on the ladle.
How do you account for that? No. These are very, yeah. So there's no question that each one of these points has to be calculated, but yet the Gemara does not necessarily say, oh, I lose from the ladle, so I don't have to count shmarim. I can account for the loss on the ladle, like you point out, David. It's a very good kasha, because somewhere along the line you're going to lose a little bit. So why do you hang your hat just on the shmarim and argue whether or not you should deduct for sediment? Deduct just because every time you dip in, you lose a drop or 3 just in the activity of trying to pitch out the oil from the barrel. It's a good point. The Gemara does not raise it, and the Gemara seems to hang its hat on the shemarim, on the sediment as being the real culprit for why it's okay to deduct 1.5. But I think you're right that as a practical matter, you can argue that there are other ways that drips and drops of oil can get lost without it having to be just the sediment at the bottom of the barrel. But
when you transfer a barrel, you use a whole barrel. Barrel is going to a place who's going to subdivide that into little jars. Nobody's going to work with a full barrel in the house.
Apparently here, this guy was a wholesaler, and people came to him to get oil like once a month for their needs. So he did have one big vat, which he mixed, by the way. And this is the shaila. Remember last week we had a whole discussion of did he mix it with his own, or did he keep it separate, so that if he kept it separate, then it's easy to calculate what the shrinkage is. The teretz is he mixed it with his own. In our case, he did the same thing. Rashi said earlier, and maybe we missed that, Rashi. Rashi said at the very beginning, he said, Im hifkid etzlo yain ve'irvu im yeno. He mixed it with his own. So in other words, he did mix the wine or the oil with his own and kept, because he was a wholesaler, and he said, what am I going to break it up? I'll keep everything in one vat. The whole town will come to me one by one, and I'll ladle out their portion. And at the end, if someone wants, there's a balance, I'll give them back the balance. But that balance now included everybody in the town's oil. So you can't really say your oil was more or less than somebody else. I'll tell you what the cheshbon is. You took 15. You took 15 out of the 100. I'll give you back 100 minus 15 minus 1.5. So I'll give you back 13.5, or I'll take off 13.5. So, but the point is though that we're being so fine here as to try to get to almost an exact number, which, as we're talking here, we realize you may not be able to get to a very exact number, because something along the way will either drop or drip or something will happen. And but the Gemara doesn't account for that. The Gemara says, no, we're just going to go straight by what happened in the Maisa. So,
But the
Also,
Gemara
excuse me,
really
Rab,
is.
Yeah, Jay, go ahead.
It is because further back where it's going when about the product for labor, if he's separating out large quantities, he has to take in consideration for the time and expense of him pouring off from the larger barrel to the smaller.
yeah.
It says that in the note
We
further
did,
back.
we did. But so apparently here, no, you're right. The Gemara here does not at this point make that point that you have to account for that tircha. But you make a good point. Is that what about the work ethic portion of it? There is at least something that should be accounted for the work. You're right. So at the end of the day, he's not asking for more than 1.5. He's not saying give me 1.5 plus another whatever. He's just saying, give me my 1.5. I'll be satisfied if you just give me the 1.5, and I'll include my tircha, and I'll include my everything else that I have to do to stay in business in that 1.5. Remember, this is at the time of the Gemara. We were talking about large profit margins and millionaires and everything else. We're talking about people who are just getting by the meager standards that we sort of can imagine they live by. So if he had to get by with 1.5 and include his work, his labor, his time, hiring the guy to make the hole, whatever it happened to be. And Shmuel is limiting him to a 6 to begin with. So get rich quick, he's not. So it's a little bit, again, we're applying our standards, David, to what existed 2,000 years ago, or in the time of the Gemara, a little less, and just trying to understand how they got by and what these standards were, and then taking those halachas and now bringing them forward to our time and trying to figure out how those halachas impact us in our business. Clearly, we're in a totally different world, and but we have certain basic fundamental principles that we should try to adhere to. I don't know about this profit margin issue, because that's one that clearly has been blown away by the halacha. But again, we'll put that aside and try to figure that one out. But as far as the actual administration on on how to do it and what to do, the care by which you have to not overcharge, and you shouldn't undercharge, but you shouldn't overcharge so that someone is paying for something that he didn't get. That's really, I think, what we want to bring out of this tomorrow. Yeah.
Excuse me, Rabbi, but we have
Jay?
to, at some point, we have to stop with the minute measurements. You can't be, they could not be as accurate as you would like to have. So for example, you're not going to get into the question of whether it was a metal ladle or a wooden ladle.
Right.
You're also not going to worry about whether or not the measuring, the way the wholesaler sold his stuff, he may have had a scale there, a balance scale, and he could basically do it by weight because the product is fixed, and then not, at least he can do it repeatedly, the weight, in order to balance.
Right.
Assume that he sold the right amount to a person.
Right.
And then
So I get the feeling that this 1.5 was like a sui generis number that we said, you know what, it's how they came up to 1.5, the Gemara doesn't explain, but they say that that's what should be the measurement. My guess is that when they were trying to figure this out in Mekach and Memker, how do we deal with it? We have to take our best educated guess as to what the costs involve. Why couldn't they have said that it's 2 lug for Shomrim? Why is it 1.5? Terence says the 1.5 was probably for what you just said. We got to account for about a half a dozen different things. We can't be so minute that every little thing is going to be a half of a nickel, a half of a penny. Let's just establish a number and say that that number is the expense covering all of the work. So 1.5 lug is the expense that covers the ladle, the absorption, or not the absorption was separate, but the ladle, the drippage, the tircha, making the hole, you name it, all the different components that come into this business should be covered by 1.5 per 100. Okay, that's how Chazal said it, and and everybody accepted it.
And
They could have said 1 3/4.
They could have set up a scale to measure 1.5.
Maybe they could have. Yeah, you're right. Maybe they could have set up a scale, might have been easier, but obviously they did not. And as a result, they said, forget about everything else, just give them back minus 1.5.
Right.
Or the amount of absorption. In any event, so we've now covered a part of this, the first two parts of the Mishnah. I think we'll stop because the rest of this Gemara all the way down goes back and forth on this question of the pure oil versus the shomrim. In other words, the machlokes between Tanna Kama and Rabbi Yehuda, what's the depth of that machlokes? So we have to stop because the next segment will go all the way to the next Mishnah next week. We'll cover all of that, but suffice it to say that it's not just so simple that okay, you take 1.5 and you're good to go. There's a lot of svara behind it, and Mitzvah Shem will go through. But nevertheless, you do see that there are different. There's machlokes here, generally speaking, whether or not you're allowed to do that, whether you can subtract it, and what is it dependent on? Is it dependent on the barrel? Is it dependent on the karka? Is it dependent on the on what you line it with? These were the issues of the day, as they say. That this is how the Beis Din sort of figured out how to deal with Mekach and Memker. And when you think of the 21st century and the sophistication that we deal with, it blows us away as to it was a simpler time, a simpler life, and there wasn't there wasn't computers, there wasn't we can measure to the 10th power.
Very decimal point.
Exactly. So anyway, so Mitzvah Shem. Okay, so we'll stop here on the day, and we'll pick up next week, Mitzvah Shem.
Sure.